Thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to do my talk on visual aspects of Old East Slavic writing. So the so-called vernacular writing system that we see on birch-bark has been characterized as a writing system which relies on open syllables. Since Old East Slavic at that time was comprised almost exclusively of open syllables, which we see reflected in writing. Open syllables, if you don't know, are those which either end in a vowel or consist solely of a vowel. So what I'm arguing today is that the syllable explanation does not cover every feature of the writing system. I argue that thinking of the writing system in terms of two licensing directions, however, can include visual information and cover more characteristics relevant for graphematics. So broken down, my claim is the following. So speech dictates how we write. That was one direction that is prevalent in modern graphematics. But writing also influences how we speak, or rather read out loud. That is, visual aspects have been neglected in the literature as I see it, but are important to consider as well. This reasoning applies particularly to numerical writing. The ligature ot, which is heterosyllabic, also does not fit the syllable explanation in open syllable terms. So it further applies to abbreviations and to special markings of left word edges. And I'm going to show you a number of examples for all of that in just a minute. So first, let me give you an introduction to the medieval state of Kievan Rus, birch-bark literacy in medieval Novgorod, and just a few notes on the Old Cyrillic alphabet. So Kievan Rus was the first East Slavic state in the 10th to 13th centuries, comprised of many parts of northern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Since baptism of the state in 945 AD under Byzantine readers, we have a literary tradition in Kievan Rus. Writing was reserved for ecclesiastical purposes, historiography, and official documents. Before the discovery of birch-bark texts in the 1950s, we have more or less a mixture of Church Slavic literature and Old East Slavic vernacular elements sprinkled in, so to say. One example of such a mixed text leaning more towards Old East Slavic is the Ruskaya Pravda, which is a legal document. Where we find those East Slavic reflexes, we speak of a vernacular orthography, and we have the so-called bookish orthography, which adheres more closely to Church Slavic traditions and South Slavic traditions, just rather than East Slavic traditions. On this map, you can see Veliki Novgorod right here, and Kyiv is right here. You won't find Moscow on this map because it enters the picture later. So in 1951, the first birch-bark texts were unearthed in Veliki Novgorod. And to date, yearly excavations in Veliki Novgorod have amassed a number of 1,260 birch-bark texts as of March 2026. And I just checked it today, the number is still accurate. However, this number does not include the findings of 2025. However, there were less than 10 birch-bark texts unearthed in Veliki Novgorod. There is a lecture on YouTube in Russian if you're interested. So the texts originate from the 10th to the 15th centuries, roughly, and literacy was reserved for the upper strata of society. So we have the clergy who could read and write, the noble elites such as the princes, the rulers, but we also find craftsmen that signed their wares and business people. Most of the documents, furthermore, are concerned with everyday life. They are personal letters, business transactions, writing exercises, and personal notes. So the situation we have for Novgorodian literacy in particular is quite unique when compared to other official documents from the time dealing with official matters, of course. Most of the documents, furthermore, are very short, so they contain approximately 20 words each, and most of them are sadly heavily fragmented. So what you see on the right side of the slide is a post stamp where you can see not only the birch bark, but also the writing instruments used to carve out the markings on birch bark. So the conditions for preserving this birch bark for over 1,000 years in most cases is due to the ground conditions in Veliki Novgorod, rather than Veliki Novgorod being the only center of medieval literacy. The clay in the soil particularly is good for preserving organic material. So before I'm going to go into my examples, I'm going to give you a short overview of historical Cyrillic graphematics. So in this slide, I have provided you with the first 4 basic shapes in the old Cyrillic alphabet, a Latinized version in the next column, the name of the basic shape, the translation of that name into English, as well as the numerical value and the corresponding sound. Old Cyrillic is special in this regard because we do not only have the basic shape, but each basic shape has its name. So we have as the first basic shape, and this is kind of a mnemonic device also for learning the alphabet, because the sequence of the first 3 letters translates to I know the letters. And as you can readily see, the basic shape can serve as an abbreviation of a whole word. The numerical value of old Cyrillic letters is based upon Greek numerical notation. So in an overview of the alphabet, we have already identified 2 specifics of writing on birch bark that are not related to the corresponding sound. So they are not phonographic or not purely phonographic. It is the visual information that relates to meaning in numerical notation and abbreviations. So the most prominent characteristic of the so-called vernacular writing system is the alternation of what we call the frontier, which is the first basic shape you can see here, and E. The so-called backier and O are also not distinguished in writing. So we have grammatical alternation between a number of basic shapes and that are said to correspond to the same sound. And this view is expressed by Zelezniak, who was the leading expert in birch-bark literacy and the Old Novgorodian dialect in particular. So the consequence of this grammatical effect is that we have many possible and legitimized spelling variants in the vernacular writing system when compared to the standard or bookish orthography. Recently, the acquisition of writing has been explained as a driving force of the alternation of these basic shapes. So this is a recent reinforcement of the syllable explanation. So Zhivov and Petruchin following him explained that learning to read not only Old East Slavic but also Church Slavic was achieved by learning to read syllables and not individual letters, as we would have done in our school time maybe. So basic shapes are sequenced into syllabic sequences, as in the example here, and identified by their name. So we get bukias, then we read the combination of basic shapes and then get ba, the corresponding sound sequence. Petruchin thus states that the Old East Slavic vernacular writing system is an alphabetical system with elements of syllable writing, because we have these prominent open syllables, even where we would not expect a vowel from an etymological point of view. So they were written where we would not expect them. So the syllable explanation serves to explain a number of facts about grammatical alternations. If the syllable is the distinctive unit, that is the syllable identified as a whole, then it is indeed maybe not so important which basic shape you write, as long as you get no minimal pairs or meaning distinctions between them. So what's the problem with this explanation? And I already told you that in my introduction, but some frequent spellings are ignored in the literature on birch-bark texts. So the corpus is, of course, a very small one. It comprises about 30,000 words, so we can't really argue based on the word frequency, but frequent spellings, which I have lumped together as types, do not fit the syllable explanation because they are not syllabic or not purely syllabic. There's a visual element to them. And there's an overarching problem as well, because in most theoretical accounts of writing, grammatical accounts of writing, that is, within linguistics, writing is seen as a result of connecting units of spoken language to units of written language in a regular way and in this order. So this is commonly referred to as phonography. Broken down, it means that written runes refer to sounds. But we also have morphography, and this has largely been ousted in discussions of largely alphabetic writing systems, because those systems, as Old East Slavic, are largely phonographical. So you have correspondence between the written language and the spoken language, but you may also have a relationship between the written language and the meaning. Chinese, for example, has been classified as a largely, but not purely, morphographic system. As Meletis and Dushite have offered in 2022, most, if not all, writing systems to some degree incorporate features characteristic of other types of writing systems. So you'd see that in German, for example, where you have final obstruent devoicing. You say Hund, you write EHUND for etymological reasons, but you say Hund with a final T. So you rely on the morphological or the etymological spelling here. Writing this is not purely phonetic. Of course, even the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, cannot cover all the phonetic facts of language in writing. So what I propose is that we have two licensing directions to consider. The licensing direction 1 is what I'm going to talk about today, which is written to spoken. So the written word licenses the spoken word, or speak as you write. What we could say is a kind of morphography. The visual information is the driving factor here. The second licensing direction is also important in a phonographical writing system, of course. And that's the one from spoken to written. So write as you speak. And I'm going to talk about that today because, of course, we're concerned with visual information today. Okay, let's start with the discussion of licensing direction 2, or morphographic licensing, as I call it, the speak as you write direction. So on the upper hand of each example, you have the Cyrillic original with the spacing taken over from the database. And I transliterated this into a Latinized version, so it's easier to follow maybe. So we have numerical writing here, which is realized solely through the basic shapes and the corresponding numerical values, and it's indicated by those colons. So the I, as you see, corresponds to 10, whereas ger corresponds to 3 and ve to 2, as I showed you before. So we do not have a one-to-one correspondence of written to spoken, but we have to know, well, something else. We have to know the conventionalized meaning of this written sign, and the marker, the double colon here, mark the numerical interpretation as well. We find also mixed numerical notation, as I call it. So we get the 6 in morphographic notation. Then we also have the sequence of basic shapes right here, adjacent to that, which is a phonographic sti sequence completing this numerical expression. It's giving us some kind of a hint of how to send out the morphographic information here. And I have an English example later. And also the second one here, spelled out collectively as dve, whereas simple vede would yield probably dva, the masculine form, also giving a hint on pronunciation. The ligature ot corresponds to a heterosyllabic sequence of ot. I argue that the ligature is a morphographic element, and it primarily refers to the preposition or the prefix ot, from. So we have the following example about from Griksha to Yusuf. Onania sent something and I answered him something. So in this example, we have both occurrences of morphographic ot, both correspond to the same sound sequence, but once it is used as a prefix and once as a preposition. The following birch-bark contains quite a number of abbreviations, and it is oriented towards Church Slavic norms where such abbreviations are frequent. The titlo marker, you can see above some of the basic shapes here, is used to indicate abbreviation, not always, but in most cases. So it says, and I do not owe anyone anything except my soul to God. And you see both God and soul are abbreviated. And to that God, again abbreviated, is witness and my spiritual father, again abbreviated, about the Demit of Saint Nicholas and the priest offerings of the Holy Mother of God. And you see the holy or saint in both cases, and the mother is abbreviated here. Resolved, you see that quite a number of basic shapes are missing to form the phonographic spelling. So what we can see here is that a one-to-one correspondence, as in standard phonographic writing, is absent. We cannot capture abbreviations within the syllable explanation, as you can also clearly see. So we only have the last syllable or the last basic shape in the syllabic sequence, in some cases, as a consequence. But most parts of the word are missing. And so the last example of the writing to speaking direction is the special marking of left word edges. And this is the only one that the syllable explanation can cover. So what we have here is an example of that in which I have marked two different basic shapes using different colors. So the yellow U-type or U-type basic shape marks an independent syllable U, and the green basic shape is used to mark a syllable with a consonant preceding the U. So the example reads as, from Oleksha to Žaden, give the grain. I should have taken a grivnia from Chotyeslav, but they said he died. So rectify the situation, they say he has a cow. So we have a number of these U-type basic shapes. So we have 3 of them, which are all named Uk. Another one is called Us, which is Latinized as O with an ogonic. And in Church Slavic orthography, this basic shape refers to a nasal vowel, which is, however, extinct in Old East Slavic and so corresponds to U as well. So the rule is you choose one of those for an independent syllable, typically at the left word edge, and you use another one for all other places if you are to make such a distinction. Roughly 30% of birch-bark texts exhibit this distinction, but if scribes do distinguish between them, the distinction is almost always regular. We also have this with O-type basic shapes. So the U-type basic shapes are not an isolated example. This is a bow from Onufri, you Lord Onsifor something. The 2 O-type basic shapes are also distinguished by their position. The Greek omega refers to a syllabic O, while the other O refers to O with a consonant in front of it. The omega in Onsifor, furthermore, is used to mark the name of a person, which may also be of some significance here. The interesting thing now is that the basic shapes actually have different numerical values, so they are different. It's not the same grapheme. This is a whole another this discussion that I'm not going to go into today. So we have the basic shape O, which has a numerical value of 80, and we have some especially marked basic shape with a dot in the middle, and there are a few others. And we have quite distinct from that the Greek omega visually, which has a numerical value of 700. So we have seen that visual differences are quite meaningful in written Old East Slavic. And I have tried to visualize my conclusions of the 2 licensing directions into sort of 2 continua. We have the spoken to written continuum on the left side on the y-axis, and the higher you go on the y-axis, the more phonetic information is represented. So the closer the relation of spoken and written language. On the x-axis, the higher you go up on the scale, the more conventional the relationship between written and spoken language is, bearing in mind that, of course, the corresponding sound is also a matter of conventionality, of something that you have learned. So the conventional, more morphographic side of things hosts the numeral, as I would say, quite to the right side of the scale. So you would not only have to recognize the basic shape and its corresponding sound, but also its numerical value. And you may not have all the information. You do not need to know the corresponding sound or the name of the basic shape to identify its numerical value, but you need all three kinds of information to be literate in the writing system as a whole and to be able to read the letters that came to you. Then you would have the name of the basic shape. You would have to know how to use it in abbreviation. And following Church Slavic traditions, it's not always the name of the basic shape that the abbreviation refers to. So as we have seen, the abbreviation for Buki is actually, in most cases, God, Bog. Word beginning is thus quite conventionalized. And what I argue is that the syllable has a prominent state. So the syllable is determined by convention on the one hand, because of the special marking of left word edges in particular, which are open syllables or independent syllables in most cases when we have vowels there. But because we also write as we speak, syllables also under scrutiny, you could say, of the spoken to written relation. So the syllable fulfills kind of a dual function here, which is why I argue the syllable is so prominent in research and also in grammatical variation in early Old East Slavic birch-bark texts. So the overarching issue in my field of study, as I said in the beginning, is the frequent grammatical alternations. So there's only one regulation really for the interchangeability, namely that the front year and the back year, so this basic shape right here and this basic shape right here, cannot be used at the beginning of a word or as an independent syllable. So Zelizniak and Petruchin state that there is no sound difference. It's just a grammatical preference or a rule. And the interchangeability is due to the syllable being the distinctive unit. So, and I'm not going to contest that per se, but I argue that my proposal refines this conclusion and adds visual information into a theory of Old East Slavic writing. So including morphography into the theory allows to cover not only a wider range of characteristics of the writing system than the syllable writing explanation alone. It is able to cover abbreviations and a numerical notation. The special standing of the syllable in this writing system is dealt with through the distinction of positions in which the grammatic alternations occur. So not only do we now know how the syllable is so important from previous research, I can now explain why it is so important. And we also see this morphographic relation in grammatics of modern languages. You also see this in English orthography. So we have a distinction between writing 25 grams of salt, where we only see 25. But in, for example, Wednesday, March 25th, you see that the TH may serve as a marker that tells us to pronounce the 5 part differently than we would normally do. So the way we write also influences the way we speak. And some other examples include the title of the song Skater Boy by Avril Lavigne, which you may know from the early 2000s, where you have the 8, which is inserted as a morphographic marker, but used here for its phonographical correspondence. So it's not really the numerical value of 8, which is indicated here, but the phonographical correspondence. You may have seen instances of see you later in chats written with reference to, you could say, the names of the letters here. And now all that is left for me to say is thank you very much for your attention.